Margaret Thompson had been working at Buckingham Palace for over 20 years. She started as a young woman fresh out of college, and now at 45 she knew every corner of the royal residence like the back of her hand. Her job as a senior palace guard wasn't just about security anymore. She had become a keeper of memories, a witness to history, and someone who truly understood the weight of tradition that lived within these walls. The morning started like any other Tuesday in October. Margaret put on her crisp uniform, pinned her identification badge carefully, and walked through the staff entrance she had used thousands of times before. The autumn air was crisp and the leaves in the palace gardens were turning golden brown. She loved this time of year because it reminded her of when she first started working here, full of dreams and respect for the royal family. As she made her rounds through the palace corridors, Margaret's mind wandered to Queen Elizabeth. Even though the Queen had passed away over a year ago, her presence still felt strong in every room. Margaret remembered how the Queen would nod politely when they crossed paths, always acknowledging the staff with genuine warmth. Those small moments had meant everything to Margaret, making her feel like she was part of something much bigger than herself. Today was different, though. Word had spread through the staff quarters that Queen Camilla was planning something special for an upcoming royal event. Margaret had heard whispers in the corridors, fragments of conversations between other staff members about wedding dresses and royal traditions. At first, she didn't pay much attention to the gossip. Palace staff were always talking about one thing or another, and most of it turned out to be nothing more than rumors. But as the morning progressed, Margaret began to piece together what she was hearing. During her coffee break, she sat with Emma, one of the housekeeping staff who worked closely with the royal family's personal belongings. Emma looked troubled as she stirred her tea, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something that looked like worry. Emma explained that she had been asked to prepare Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress for some kind of special occasion. The dress, a masterpiece of silk and intricate embroidery, had been carefully preserved since the Queen's wedding day in 1947. It was more than just a piece of clothing. It represented hope, love, and the beginning of a marriage that had lasted over 70 years. Emma told Margaret that she felt uncomfortable about the whole situation, but she couldn't quite explain why. Margaret felt a strange uneasiness growing in her stomach. Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress wasn't just any dress. It was a symbol of everything the late Queen had stood for. During the difficult years of World War II, that dress had represented hope for better times. The Queen had even saved up ration coupons to buy the material, showing that even royalty wasn't above the struggles ordinary people faced during the war. As Margaret continued her duties that afternoon, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She found herself walking past the room where the royal garments were stored, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Through the slightly open door, she could see several people carefully handling what looked like the Queen's wedding dress. The sight made her heart race with a mixture of anxiety and protectiveness. The more Margaret thought about it, the more convinced she became that she needed to find out exactly what was being planned. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. She felt a responsibility to protect Queen Elizabeth's memory and everything she had represented. Margaret had devoted her entire adult life to serving the royal family, and she couldn't stand by if something inappropriate was about to happen to such an important piece of royal history. That evening, as Margaret finished her shift, she made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find out the truth about what Queen Camilla was planning, and if necessary, she was prepared to speak up about it. The thought scared her because she had never challenged anyone in the royal family before, but her love and respect for Queen Elizabeth gave her the courage she needed to take action. The next morning, Margaret arrived at work earlier than usual. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with questions about Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress. As she walked through the quiet palace corridors, she noticed more activity than normal in the royal wardrobe department. Several staff members were moving back and forth carrying garment bags and looking serious about their work. Margaret decided to speak with James, the head of the royal wardrobe department. James had been working at the palace even longer than Margaret, and if anyone knew what was really happening, it would be him. She found him in his small office, surrounded by fabric samples and old photographs of royal outfits from decades past. When Margaret knocked on his door, James looked up with tired eyes. He invited her in and closed the door behind her, which immediately told Margaret that this conversation was going to be sensitive. James explained that he had been asked to make alterations to Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress so that Queen Camilla could wear it at an upcoming royal charity event. The event was meant to honor Queen Elizabeth's memory, but James felt deeply uncomfortable about the whole situation. James told Margaret that the dress would need significant changes to fit Queen Camilla properly. The original dress was made for a young woman in 1947, and now it would need to be adjusted for someone completely different. He worried that making these changes would damage the historical integrity of the dress and disrespect Queen Elizabeth's memory. James had tried to suggest using a replica instead, but his concerns had been dismissed. Margaret felt her heart sink as she listened to James's explanation. The idea of altering Queen Elizabeth's actual wedding dress seemed wrong on so many levels. This wasn't just any piece of clothing that could be modified for convenience. It was a piece of history that had witnessed one of the most important moments in the late Queen's life. Every stitch, every detail had meaning and significance that couldn't be replaced or recreated. As the day progressed, Margaret found it impossible to concentrate on her regular duties. She kept thinking about Queen Elizabeth and how much that wedding dress had meant to her. During her lunch break, Margaret walked through the palace gardens where Queen Elizabeth used to take her daily walks. She remembered seeing the Queen there countless times, always dignified, always graceful, always aware of her duty to the people and to history. Margaret realized that she couldn't stay silent about this situation. Someone needed to speak up for Queen Elizabeth, who could no longer speak for herself. The thought of confronting Queen Camilla terrified Margaret, but she knew it was the right thing to do. She had spent 20 years protecting the royal family in the palace, and now she needed to protect the memory and legacy of the Queen she had admired so much. That afternoon, Margaret learned that Queen Camilla would be visiting the wardrobe department to see the dress and discuss the alterations. This would be Margaret's chance to speak up, but she knew she had to be careful about how she approached the situation. Speaking out of turn to a member of the royal family could cost her job, but staying silent felt like betraying everything she believed in. Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon preparing what she would say. She thought about Queen Elizabeth's dedication to duty, her unwavering commitment to serving others, and her deep respect for tradition and history. These were the values that had guided Margaret's own career, and now they were guiding her toward a confrontation she never could have imagined. As evening approached, Margaret received word that Queen Camilla would be arriving soon. Her heart began to race as she realized that the moment of truth was almost here. She positioned herself near the wardrobe department, trying to look like she was performing her normal security duties while actually preparing for the most important conversation of her career. When Queen Camilla's entourage finally arrived, Margaret felt her courage beginning to waver. But then she thought about Queen Elizabeth one more time, and she knew that she had to find the strength to speak up. The fate of a precious piece of royal history was hanging in the balance, and Margaret was the only one willing to fight for it. Queen Camilla entered the wardrobe department with her usual confidence, accompanied by 2 personal assistants and a private secretary. Margaret watched from her position near the doorway, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. The Queen Consort looked elegant in a navy blue dress, her jewelry catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. She moved with the grace that came from years of royal training, but Margaret noticed something else in her expression that looked like determination. James, the head of the wardrobe department, greeted Queen Camilla with a respectful bow and began showing her Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress. The dress was displayed on a special mannequin, and even from where Margaret stood she could see how beautiful and delicate it looked. The silk had aged to a soft ivory color, and the intricate embroidery still sparkled with tiny pearls and crystals that had been sewn on by hand over 70 years ago. Queen Camilla examined the dress carefully, discussing various details with James about the alterations that would be needed. Margaret could hear fragments of their conversation about taking in the waist, adjusting the sleeves, and modifying the neckline. Each suggestion felt like a small wound to Margaret's heart. She thought about Queen Elizabeth wearing this dress on her wedding day, young and hopeful, surrounded by family and friends who had survived the war and were looking forward to a brighter future. As the conversation continued, Margaret realized that Queen Camilla seemed completely comfortable with the idea of making these changes. There was no hesitation in her voice, no acknowledgement of the historical significance of what she was proposing. This realization gave Margaret the final push she needed to take action. She couldn't stand by and watch this happen without at least trying to speak up. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped forward into the room. The sudden appearance of a palace guard in what was clearly a private meeting caused immediate surprise. Queen Camilla's assistants moved closer to her, and James looked shocked that Margaret had interrupted such an important discussion. The room fell completely silent, and Margaret could feel everyone's eyes on her. With as much respect as she could manage, Margaret addressed Queen Camilla directly. She introduced herself and explained that she had been working at the palace for 20 years, serving the royal family with complete dedication. Her voice was steady, but inside she was shaking with nervousness. She had never spoken to any member of the royal family about anything more serious than daily security matters. Margaret then began to explain her concerns about altering Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress. She spoke about the historical importance of the dress and what it had meant to the late queen. She mentioned how Queen Elizabeth had saved ration coupons during the war to buy the material, making the dress a symbol of hope and perseverance during difficult times. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she talked about how much the dress represented, about Queen Elizabeth's character and values. Queen Camilla listened to Margaret's words with a neutral expression. That was difficult to read. Her assistants looked uncomfortable, clearly unsure about how to handle this unexpected challenge from a staff member. James stood frozen, probably worried about what would happen to both him and Margaret after this confrontation. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air itself had become heavy. Margaret continued speaking, explaining that she felt a responsibility to protect Queen Elizabeth's memory and legacy. She suggested that perhaps a replica of the dress could be made instead, which would allow Queen Camilla to honor the late queen without risking damage to the original garment. Margaret's hands were trembling now, but her voice remained clear and respectful throughout her entire speech. When Margaret finished speaking, the room remained silent for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds. Queen Camilla's expression had changed during Margaret's speech, but it was still impossible to tell what she was thinking. Margaret realized that she had just done something that could destroy her career and her life at the palace, but she also felt a sense of relief that she had finally spoken up for what she believed was right. The next few moments would determine everything that happened next, not just for Margaret, but potentially for Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress and the way royal traditions would be handled in the future. Queen Camilla's reaction was not what Margaret had expected. Instead of anger or immediate dismissal, the queen consort took a step closer to Margaret and looked directly into her eyes. There was something in Queen Camilla's expression that Margaret couldn't quite identify at first, but then she realized it might be respect. The silence stretched on, making everyone in the room increasingly nervous about what would happen next. Finally, Queen Camilla spoke, and her voice was much gentler than Margaret had anticipated. She thanked Margaret for speaking up and acknowledged that it had taken courage to voice her concerns. Queen Camilla explained that she hadn't fully considered all the implications of altering the original dress, and she appreciated hearing a different perspective on the matter. This response surprised everyone in the room, especially Margaret, who had been prepared for much harsher consequences. Queen Camilla then asked Margaret to explain more about what the dress had meant to Queen Elizabeth personally. Margaret found herself telling stories she had heard over the years about the late Queen's wedding day. She spoke about how Queen Elizabeth had been so careful with the dress, how she had treasured it throughout her life, and how it had been preserved as one of the most important artifacts from her reign. Margaret's nervousness began to fade as she realized that Queen Camilla was genuinely interested in what she had to say. As Margaret continued talking, she noticed that Queen Camilla's expression had become thoughtful and somewhat sad. The Queen consort began to share her own memories of Queen Elizabeth, talking about the conversations they had had about tradition, duty, and the weight of royal responsibilities. Queen Camilla explained that she had wanted to wear the dress as a way of honoring Queen Elizabeth's memory and showing continuity between their reigns, but she was beginning to understand that there might be better ways to achieve that goal. The conversation took on a completely different tone as both women found themselves bonding over their shared respect for Queen Elizabeth. Margaret learned that Queen Camilla had been feeling pressure to establish her own place in royal history, while also honoring the legacy of her predecessor. The idea of wearing Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress had seemed like a perfect solution, but now Queen Camilla was seeing it from a different angle. James, who had been standing quietly throughout this exchange, finally found the courage to speak up as well. He supported Margaret's suggestion about creating a replica of the dress, explaining that this would allow Queen Camilla to pay tribute to Queen Elizabeth without risking any damage to the original garment. He offered to work with the finest craftspeople in England to create a replica that would be historically accurate and beautiful, while preserving the original. For future generations, Queen Camilla listened carefully to James's proposal and asked detailed questions about how such a replica could be made. She seemed genuinely interested in ensuring that every detail would be perfect, from the type of silk used to the exact placement of each pearl and crystal. Margaret watched this conversation with growing relief, realizing that her decision to speak up had led to a much better solution for everyone involved. The discussion continued for another 30 minutes, with Queen Camilla, Margaret, and James working together to plan how the replica dress project would proceed. Margaret was amazed to find herself participating in royal planning discussions, something she never could have imagined when she woke up that morning. Queen Camilla treated her opinions with respect and asked for her input on various aspects of the project. As the meeting began to wind down, Queen Camilla turned to Margaret one more time. She thanked her again for having the courage to speak up, and explained that this conversation had taught her an important lesson about the value of listening to different perspectives. Queen Camilla said that Margaret's dedication to Queen Elizabeth's memory was exactly the kind of loyalty and respect that made the royal staff so special. Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized that not only had she saved Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress from being altered, but she had also earned the respect of Queen Camilla in the process. The confrontation she had feared so much had turned into a meaningful conversation that would change how royal traditions were handled in the future. Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself in an unexpected position within the palace hierarchy. Queen Camilla had asked her to serve as a special advisor on matters relating to Queen Elizabeth's personal belongings and royal traditions. This new role meant that Margaret would work closely with various departments to ensure that the late Queen's legacy was preserved and honored appropriately. It was a responsibility that Margaret took very seriously, knowing that she was now the voice for someone who could no longer speak for herself, and the project to create a replica of Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress became much more elaborate than anyone had initially imagined. Queen Camilla had decided that this would be an opportunity to showcase the finest British craftsmanship while creating something truly spectacular. Master seamstresses, embroiderers, and jewelers from across the United Kingdom were brought in to work on different aspects of the dress. Margaret was involved in every step of the process, ensuring that historical accuracy was maintained throughout. Margaret spent hours in the royal archives, studying photographs and documents from Queen Elizabeth's wedding day. She discovered details about the dress that even James hadn't known, including the specific meanings behind different embroidery patterns and the stories behind individual pearls that had been sewn onto the fabric. Each discovery made Margaret feel more connected to Queen Elizabeth's memory and more determined to ensure that the replica would be perfect. The media eventually learned about the replica dress project, and the story captured public attention in a way that surprised everyone at the palace. People were fascinated by the idea of recreating such an iconic piece of royal history, and many saw it as a beautiful way to honor Queen Elizabeth's memory. Margaret found herself being interviewed by journalists who wanted to understand how the project had come about and what it meant to the people working on it. During one particularly memorable interview, Margaret was asked about her decision to challenge Queen Camilla about the original dress. She explained that her love and respect for Queen Elizabeth had given her the courage to speak up, even when it seemed risky to do so. Margaret emphasized that Queen Camilla had shown tremendous grace and wisdom in listening to different perspectives and ultimately choosing the path that best honored royal traditions. As the charity event approached, Margaret began to feel nervous about how the public would receive the replica dress. So much work had gone into making it perfect, and she wanted Queen Elizabeth to be honored in the most beautiful way possible. The dress had been created with extraordinary attention to detail, using silk that was as close as possible to the original and embroidery work that rivaled anything that had been done in the 1940s. The night before the charity event, Margaret was given a private viewing of the completed replica dress. When she saw it displayed in the same room where Queen Elizabeth's original dress was kept, she was overwhelmed with emotion. The replica was absolutely stunning, capturing every nuance of the original while standing as its own masterpiece. Margaret felt proud knowing that she had played a role in creating something so beautiful and meaningful. Queen Camilla also came to see the dress that evening, and she spent a long time examining every detail. She thanked Margaret once again for helping to guide the project in the right direction, explaining that wearing the replica would feel much more appropriate than altering the original. Queen Camilla said that she now understood the difference between honoring tradition and preserving it, and that Margaret had taught her an important lesson about the responsibilities that came with royal duties. As Margaret prepared to leave the palace that evening, she took one last look at both dresses. Queen Elizabeth's original wedding dress looked peaceful and dignified in its display case, exactly as it should be. The replica stood nearby, ready to carry Queen Elizabeth's memory into a new chapter of royal history. Margaret felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that she had helped ensure that both the past and the future would be honored appropriately. The next day would bring the charity event and the first public appearance of the replica dress, but Margaret already knew that the project had been a success. More importantly, she had learned that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is speak up for what they believe is right, even when it seems frightening to do so. The day of the charity event arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp and bright with golden sunlight streaming through the palace windows. Margaret had been assigned special duties for the event, working closely with the security team while also serving in her new advisory role. She felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as she prepared for what would be one of the most important days of her career. Queen Camilla looked absolutely radiant when she appeared in the replica of Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress. The craftsmanship was so extraordinary that from a distance it was impossible to tell that this wasn't the original dress. Every detail had been recreated with perfect precision, from the intricate embroidery to the way the silk fell in graceful folds. Margaret felt tears of pride and joy as she watched Queen Camilla move through the palace corridors with elegance and dignity. The charity event itself was dedicated to supporting causes that had been important to Queen Elizabeth throughout her life. Hundreds of guests attended, including members of the royal family, government officials, charity representatives, and people from all walks of life who had been touched by Queen Elizabeth's legacy. Margaret had never seen the palace look more beautiful, with flowers and decorations that perfectly complemented the historical significance of the occasion. During the event, Queen Camilla gave a speech about Queen Elizabeth's dedication to charitable work and her commitment to serving others. She spoke movingly about the importance of preserving royal traditions while also adapting to meet the needs of modern times. Queen Camilla specifically mentioned the dress project and how it had taught her valuable lessons about balancing respect for the past with responsibilities to the future. Margaret was surprised and deeply honored when Queen Camilla publicly acknowledged her role in the dress project. In front of hundreds of distinguished guests, Queen Camilla explained how Margaret's courage and dedication had helped ensure that Queen Elizabeth's memory was honored in the most appropriate way possible. Margaret felt overwhelmed by this recognition, never having imagined that her decision to speak up would lead to such public acknowledgement. The media coverage of the event was overwhelmingly positive, with journalists and commentators praising both the beauty of the replica dress and the thoughtful way that royal traditions had been preserved. Many articles specifically mentioned Margaret's story, describing her as an example of the dedicated staff members who work behind the scenes to protect royal heritage. Margaret found herself being contacted by people from around the world who had been inspired by her willingness to stand up for what she believed was right. In the weeks following the charity event, Margaret's life at the palace changed in ways she couldn't have predicted. Her new advisory role became permanent, and she was given increased responsibilities for overseeing the preservation of royal artifacts and traditions. Margaret loved her expanded duties, feeling that she was finally able to contribute to protecting the royal heritage that meant so much to her. Queen Elizabeth's original wedding dress was moved to a new, specially designed display area, where it could be properly preserved for future generations. The replica dress was also preserved, representing not just Queen Elizabeth's legacy, but also the importance of finding creative ways to honor tradition while meeting contemporary needs. Margaret visited both dresses regularly, always feeling a sense of connection to the history they represented. Years later, Margaret would often reflect on that crucial moment when she decided to speak up about Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress. That decision had changed not only her own life but had also influenced how royal traditions would be handled in the future. She had learned that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is find the courage to voice their convictions, especially when it comes to protecting something precious and irreplaceable. Margaret's story became part of palace folklore, inspiring other staff members to take pride in their roles as guardians of royal history. She had shown that everyone, regardless of their position, had a responsibility to speak up when something important was at stake. Most importantly, she had ensured that Queen Elizabeth's memory would be preserved with the dignity and respect it deserved, creating a legacy that would inspire people for generations to come. The replica dress continued to be used for special occasions, always reminding people of the beautiful balance between honoring the past and embracing the future. Margaret's courage had created something beautiful and lasting, proving that one person's voice can make a difference when they stand up for what they truly believe in.